So welcome everybody. My introduction will be extremely short because it's my pleasure tonight to welcome the introducer. One of the great joys of working here at Annenberg and with the Centre on Public Diplomacy is to have the utter and unadulterated support of the Dean, whom you met last week, but also his entire office. And Carola Weil is the Associate Dean for Planning and Strategic Initiatives at Annenberg. She has an extremely interesting background career, Washington-based, inside the Beltway and other things, but she has worked at for Women in International Security. She worked at Maryland running a research center there. She's worked at the US Institute of Peace, and now she is here at the Annenberg developing new initiatives for us all. So Carola, the floor is yours.
Thank you all, and I understand you've been having great sessions, so we look forward to actually learning as much from you as we might have to share with you. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker of the evening, Abiodun Williams, and we were joking just before the session that Washington clearly isn't a big enough town for both of us to be at UISP, and so as I was leaving, Abi came in, and I'm delighted to say that he has taken on the position recently, within the last 6 months, as Vice President of the Center for Conflict Analysis and Prevention at the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington. And in that capacity, I'm sure you can speak to that, is actually on the front lines of public diplomacy, I think daily, just about, on everything from genocide prevention to nuclear arms control, combating of militants in South Asia, Northeast Asian rapprochement, and I'm sure I'm missing a whole bunch of other things. And of course, Africa is part of the portfolio there. Prior to joining UISP, he was the Associate Dean of the Africa Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. And this is really, in some ways, what is perhaps most relevant to our topic of discussion today on AFRICOM. He previously served also for many years, and many of us have known him, and I think many of you know him in his capacities at the UN, in the Secretary General's office. He was director of the Strategic Planning Unit in the Executive Office of the UN Secretary General. He also had managed relations with the UN's International Research and Training Institutes. He has practical peacekeeping experience with, I think, at least 3 assignments in Bosnia, Haiti, and Macedonia. And in addition to that, not least, and certainly not last either, he does have academic credentials as well. He's taught at Georgetown, he's taught at the University of Rochester, and he has been a fellow at Harvard University in past life. He chairs and is involved in too many task forces and committees to mention here. Let me just say that we could think of no better person to introduce the topic of tonight's discussion on AFRICOM. And I overheard a question earlier, can you say in 2 sentences what AFRICOM is? It might take more than 2 sentences, which is part of the challenge of describing AFRICOM. But I think many of us who have worked in and around the continent of Africa and have tried to deal with different approaches of resolving conflicts and improving relations with Africa, with the rest of the world. I think we're very keen to see what happens with AFRICOM. And so without further ado, Abi, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Carola. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to be here this evening. I thought since you've spent the last week at least, and you're now into your 2nd week looking at public diplomacy, I thought what I would do this evening, rather than discuss broadly all the issues relating to AFRICOM, to focus instead on the role of public diplomacy in AFRICOM's mission, since that I think is directly related to what you've been discussing about in the Summer Institute. And AFRICOM essentially was meant to realign the command structure to match the realities of the 21st century. Previously, US military engagement in Africa was divided between three commands. Central Command handled countries in the Horn of Africa. European Command was responsible for Northern and Sub-Saharan Africa, and Pacific Command was responsible for the handful of island nations off Africa's eastern shore. So the splintered approach had led to inefficiencies and undermined the US government's ability to understand emerging continental issues. So a single command led by a four-star general is meant to increase coherence, coordination, and effectiveness. In short, that's what it's meant to be about. As regards the specific topic this evening, the role of public diplomacy in AFRICOM's mission, I'm going to address three questions and then open it up to questions. The first question is, what is the nature of the problem? Because I'm going to suggest there is a problem. The second question, what are the causes of the problem? And thirdly, how can the problem be rectified? What is the nature of the problem? Essentially, AFRICOM has an image problem in Africa. There are negative perceptions of the command among leaders, among the public, the media, the civil society. This is somewhat surprising because opinion polls consistently indicate that the US has a positive image. In fact, its image is more positive in Africa than in other regions of the world. So the negative perception of AFRICOM is rather striking. If we look at two recent polls, two very recent polls reveal that distrust of the US has intensified around the globe. However, Africa is one of the few places that maintains this favorable opinion of the United States. Last July 2007, the Pew Global Attitude Survey, the United States topped the list of dependable allies in 8 of the 10 African countries which were surveyed. And these were a range of countries: Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Mali, Nigeria, South Africa, Tanzania, Uganda. They all listed the United States as their most dependable ally. The Ivory Coast listed both the United States and China as the most dependable ally, and Senegal listed France as its most dependable ally. So 8 out of the 10 countries from north, south, east, and west listed the United States as the most dependable ally. A few months ago, in April 2008, there's an article by Gallup International which revealed that approval of United States leadership in sub-Saharan Africa is about twice as high as it is in other areas of the world. This poll of 139 countries shows a 62% approval rating of US leadership among the countries of sub-Saharan Africa, compared to the 32% world median. So this is the background if you look at the perception of the United States across Africa. There is a challenge, of course, because no opinion polls or surveys currently exist that have measured public reaction to AFRICOM. So this fact itself is a setback, a serious setback to public diplomacy efforts on the continent. And I would suggest, I'll come to this later on, but I would suggest that developing metrics for success, including administering polls, surveys, interviews, what have you, should be one of the strategic objectives pursued in the US government's attempt to promote AFRICOM on the continent. Having said that there are no opinion polls or surveys that currently exist that have measured public reaction to AFRICOM, how can we then gauge reaction on the continent? And I thought perhaps we could look at the media, because the media always provide a useful barometer for gauging attitudes towards AFRICOM. And I want now to present you with a representative sampling of the headlines and the editorials on the continent. From Zambia, the Post, which was September 2007, we have the headline, "Don't be deceived by semantics." And it went on to say that Africa doesn't need any United States military bases. The establishment of any military base in any African country should be vigorously opposed by the African people. If you move from Zambia in the south to East Africa, Kenya, and the Daily Nation in February 2007 had this headline, "New United States Command will militarize ties with Africa." You move back to one of the leading countries on the continent, South Africa. The Mail and Guardian in October last year had a headline, "US Africa Command, Aid Crusader or Meddling Giant." And here I thought perhaps I could quote a little bit more extensively from that editorial. It said, "US officials dress the new regional command in a shiny altruistic uniform, saying it is designed to help Africa improve its own stability and security through good governance, the rule of law, and economic opportunity. But Africans, citing Iraq and Afghanistan, see twin dangers from AFRICOM in the form of increased US meddling and possible military intervention, and by making Africa a target of the United States' global enemies," unquote. That was from the Mail and Guardian in South Africa. So that gives you, it is a representative sampling of the commentary you get in the press, the media across the continent. And from the media, some African governments, as well as regional organizations, have also been vocal in their opposition to AFRICOM. And let's move from the sub-regions to have a flavor of this opposition. In the south, South Africa has expressed strong reservations about AFRICOM. And also in the Southern African region, SADC, the 14-nation Southern African Development Community, has rejected plans to base AFRICOM on the continent. If you move to the north, Libya, Algeria, Morocco have told US diplomats they oppose setting up an AFRICOM base anywhere in North Africa. And the 25-member Northern African Community of Saharan states last year also flatly rejected the installation of any military command or any foreign armed presence of whatever country on any part of Africa, whatever the reasons, whatever the justifications. That's from the north. Move to the west. Similarly, another, I guess, the hegemon in the west, Nigeria, has also expressed strong reservations to Africa. There seemed to be a shift in Nigeria's position, because the president of Nigeria visited Washington last December, and he made a statement following the visit which seemed to be a constructive statement regarding partnership with AFRICOM and the possible assistance that AFRICOM could provide in helping African countries set up their own standby forces of a brigade size. And then, of course, that fueled a great deal of opposition and negative reaction in Nigeria from the media, from the parliament, and he was forced to issue a clarification and pull back from what he had said following the visit to Washington. Similarly, in West Africa, the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, like SADC in the south, has also expressed reservations about the command, and West African military chiefs felt they had not been adequately consulted about AFRICOM. And last November, following a conference in Monrovia, Liberia, of the West African military chiefs, they made the point that AFRICOM had not been fully understood by African countries, and they said it was important for the United States to begin to sensitize the public opinion in Africa, and also at the highest political level. So that gives you again some sense, not only in terms of the media, the press, some sense of the positions of various governments and of regional groupings on the continent. But there's also been a problem among some of the close US allies. Liberia has been one of the more positive countries which have been more positive in terms of response to AFRICOM. And the Liberian president, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, wrote a guest editorial on allafrica.com in June 2007 called AFRICOM can help governments willing to help themselves. That was the headline of her editorial. And President Johnson Sirleaf said, if AFRICOM aims to use its soft power mandate to develop a stable environment in which civil society can flourish and the quality of life for Africans can be improved, African nations should work with AFRICOM to achieve their own development and security goals. And no sooner, of course, than this had been posted, we had a series of negative postings from Liberians who also were more negative in terms of their reaction. And one example, and there were many others, but one example was AFRICOM wrong for Liberia, disastrous for the continent, which was posted 2 days after President Sirleaf's editorial had appeared. So that's the nature of the problem. There's a serious image problem on the continent, as reflected in the editorials, in the media, in the positions of governments and some of the regional groupings. Let me now turn to the second question, which I said I would address, which is what are the causes then of this problem? And here I think there are 5 main causes of this problem. The first is that we've had mixed messages about AFRICOM and a lack of a consistent message about the mission of AFRICOM and now the goals of AFRICOM. And there's been, again, no consistency about the unique mission of AFRICOM, the goals. There were a number of iterations from the Department of Defense, which ranged from an emphasis on humanitarian-oriented activities, later an emphasis on traditional military programs. Additionally, there was a stress on the fact that this was a new whole-of-government approach to dealing with military security issues on the continent. At another stage, the emphasis was on a bureaucratic reorganization of DoD, changing the splintered approach to African security from the 3 commands to a unified command structure. So the messages have not been consistent and they've been mixed. And I think this has been one of the fundamental causes of the problem in terms of the way AFRICOM is perceived on the continent. The second main cause turns around the uncertainties about the location of AFRICOM. In fact, in my own sense, I think that was putting the cart before the horse. The location issue should have come last, at the very end, but that was put up front. And this, of course, has perpetuated misperceptions about the extent of US military commitment to the continent. First, US government officials stated that a physical presence on the continent was needed for AFRICOM. And then this position was reversed. And if you now look at AFRICOM's website, it says that no decisions have been made about the command's permanent location. So the whole issue about the location, are you going to have where is it going to be based and who is going to host it, I think has also exacerbated the problems of perception towards Africa. The third main cause of the problem is that there are African suspicions and fears about the motives of this new command. And there are a number of suspicions on the continent and a number of fears about the command. The first is that this is going to lead to a militarization of foreign policy and development assistance. And some fear that the presence of AFRICOM in Africa might turn the continent into a new theater of war and a new frontier on the war on terror. And the devastation, of course, caused in 1998 by Al-Qaeda in the bombings of the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania are all very fresh, still fresh in the minds of Africans. And there is a fear that this command will again destabilize the continent. Another fear is that the establishment of AFRICOM is driven by economic concerns. That the real purpose is that the United States needs to secure energy supplies in light of the crises in the Middle East, and there's a concomitant danger in gaining access to the region's oil fields, and that this is a driving force behind the command. Yet another concern on the part of many Africans and elites is that this is a move by the United States to counter China's growing influence, and that this is part of a new strategic competition which is going to be waged on the African continent between the United States and China. A fourth fear is that the United States will quickly withdraw when faced with hardship or difficulty. And there is a need, of course, for a long-term, sustained and steady commitment to addressing fundamental security challenges. This, of course, has been lacking in U.S. engagement in Africa. It has been one of the difficulties historically, this lack of long-term, sustained engagement with the continent. And the final concern and fear amongst some in Africa is that AFRICOM fosters a strategy of neo-colonization, and it's a neo-colonial enterprise. And for a continent which has known a history of colonialism, this brings back a number of underlying concerns. So I think all of those suspicions and fears about the motives of the new command, but the ostensible reasons and not the real reasons, have also helped to exacerbate the perceptions, the negative perceptions. Let me now turn to the fourth main cause, which is which ties up directly to the issues you've been discussing in this summer institute, which is there's been a lack of proactive public diplomacy to quell the fears and to address the suspicions. And I think the US government officials have not adequately made the case to the African public for this new command and for its continent-wide mission. I think it was Edward R. Murrow who made the point that it was important for public diplomacy to be at the takeoff if it was to be at the crash landing. And clearly, if you look at the approach to public diplomacy, clearly public diplomacy has not been at the takeoff in this enterprise, and this has only serve to fuel misperceptions and fears. And it is not evident to African peoples, to citizenry or governments, how the elements of hard power and soft power will mix, and how this would be to their benefit. And the fifth and final main cause is that there is a perception across the continent that the creation of AFRICOM was handed to African governments as a fait accompli. That's the perception. And that they were not adequately consulted during its conceptualization. And this perception persists. And I think these five main causes, the mixed messages, the uncertainties about the location, the suspicions and fears on the continent, the lack of a proactive public diplomacy to quell fears, and the perception that this was a fait accompli, that African governments were not adequately consulted, are the underlying causes of the problem which I have raised. Now, if we've moved to diagnosis, let's now perhaps try to see if we can come to some possible remedies. And here I raise the third and final question. How can the problem be rectified? I think given the existing environment, the most pressing task facing US civilian and military officials is to develop an effective public diplomacy strategy. And this public diplomacy strategy would be not only concisely explaining US goals and Africa's mission, but also would necessitate listening and interacting with African governments. But it would also mean that I think credibility in this effort would only be achieved if there's a dialogue that goes beyond the governments and engages with the African military heads, African NGOs, the media, the public, civil society. And that's one of the strengths of public diplomacy, because you not only have to engage governments, but you have to engage with other stakeholders. And I think this has to be crafted to address this problem. And AFRICOM's mission, it would be essential, has to be communicated in a way that does not breed resentment on the continent. Let me just say at this juncture that I think it is essential for AFRICOM to engage in public diplomacy. There are some who believe and argue that this is a preserve of civilians. I do not share that view, and that comes from my experience in 3 peacekeeping missions, where you have peacekeepers deployed in the mission. Public diplomacy, I believe, is far too important to be left to just civilians. What the military does has an impact, and societies has an impact on their mission, on their capacity to do their mission, has an impact, as I've been suggesting, on how the US government is perceived, our government is perceived. It has an impact also on the possibility of trying to achieve broader foreign policy goals of the United States. I think it's a very old-fashioned view to say that this is just a preserve of civilians, when, and I think there is a role for the military in shaping the strategic environment in which they operate. And of course, the bureaucratic lines which operate in Washington usually do not really matter in the field, where the actual realities and the imperatives are quite different. Having said that, I think if, as I'm suggesting, that an effective public diplomacy strategy needs to be formulated and implemented, what then should be the elements of this public diplomacy strategy? And here I think first, of course, one has to have strategic objectives. And let me go through what I think should be the strategic objectives of this public diplomacy strategy. The first, of course, is to reduce the misperceptions and the misunderstandings of AFRICOM. That should be a strategic objective of the command. The second is that AFRICOM needs to persuade the African public that their best interests would be served by AFRICOM's success, because there's a huge degree of skepticism that this would actually be the case. I think third, it is also important for the command to manage expectations of AFRICOM, that AFRICOM will provide no quick fixes, it will not be a silver bullet, and if you're going to manage the expectations of the command, it will be important for AFRICOM to develop short, medium, and long-term goals as a way to manage these expectations as to what it can and cannot achieve. And then finally, to the point which I said I'd come back to again about developing metrics for success. I'd said at the outset that part of the difficulty is, of course, there are no opinion polls that you could go to try and see what do African publics think, what do they think about AFRICOM. And I think here it's important to develop metrics for success. How will the government, the US government, measure a successful public diplomacy campaign? What polls, surveys, interviews will the government rely on to gauge public opinion? How will they assess whether or not they're succeeding? I think all of that should be considered in formulating strategic objectives on public diplomacy. Moving from, of course, the strategic objectives, it would be important to have, of course, key messages to be conveyed on the continent. And here I think there will be three key messages. The first would be to explain how AFRICOM will add real value to African security. For example, by helping to build effective security mechanisms that are beneficial to African countries. So explaining how they will add real value to African security. Second, to explain that AFRICOM will address African interests as fully as it does US interests. And third, to address the Africans' concerns about AFRICOM. And I went through all of those concerns and suspicions and fears. Those would have to be addressed in the key messages which would be put forward. Now, in terms of the audience, it is somewhat of an irony because AFRICOM is a continental command. The rationale is continental. But in terms of its public diplomacy, it has to be sensitive to local needs and regional differences. Because I do not think a public diplomacy approach, which is continental, be necessarily effective. In order to work, you have to be sensitive to regional differences, to local needs, especially in a continent which is 4 times the size of the continental United States. So the government needs to tailor its message to different audiences. Different populations will have different concerns about AFRICOM that need to be addressed separately. And AFRICOM's public diplomacy needs to understand and reflect the complexities of a diverse continent. Think of just one country. If you think of the Congo being the size of Western Europe, you begin to get a sense of the size of the place. The second, I think, underlying the point I made earlier, AFRICOM needs to engage not only with governments but also with civil society, with the media, and public diplomacy is a vital tool with which to engage with the many diverse elements of a society. But I think it will also be important for the command to leverage the power of personal relationships. Many fears and misperceptions can be alleviated through personal relationships with local citizens, and I think leveraging these personal relationships would be important. And the US government also has to adapt to the local information environments on the African continent. It has to investigate what media are in use in different countries, in different regions. How are they used? What population groups use predominantly which media? All of those things and those elements are important for an effective public diplomacy strategy. Let me also make the point about money. It often comes down to money, not only in the government but elsewhere. And here the point I would make is this, that public diplomacy should not be done on the cheap. Traditionally, we allocate too few resources to public diplomacy programs. It's what you do when you've put the budget to all the other things which are far more important, and then as an afterthought, you say, well, this is what we need to spend on public diplomacy. If we're serious about AFRICOM, we need to provide adequate resources for public diplomacy, both in absolute terms and in comparison to other allocations. So I think those, at least there's some suggestions as to how one rectifies the problem in developing a public diplomacy strategy which is effective and which has key strategic objectives, which has clear messages, which is tailored to different audiences, and one which is not done on the cheap. Now, just in conclusion, let me just say this, that US policy toward Africa will have an impact on what public diplomacy can accomplish, including the receptivity of African people and the African public, its receptivity to the messages, any messages which the government will convey. So it is absolutely important to link public diplomacy about AFRICOM to broader US policy toward Africa. This is true in other areas. You do not have, if the public diplomacy is delinked from broader US policy in whatever region, you're going to have difficulties. So you have to link it to broader US policy toward Africa. But the bottom line is, public opinion will be a critical factor in the success or failure of AFRICOM. And a public diplomacy strategy is an important way to try to address the negative perceptions about the command. And now, I'll open it up to your questions, and this session cannot but improve.
Thank you, Abi. Let me just add just a couple of comments and perhaps questions to give you all a chance to also think of other things to say. This has been a wonderful overview, I think, of the problem. But I would like to play devil's advocate and ask whether it really is only an image problem. The way, the key message that I take away from this, and perhaps others have other takes on this, but it seems to me that what you're saying is, well, we can fix, it's essentially a PR problem. We can fix the PR of AFRICOM, and then that will solve the problem of public diplomacy as conducted by a military organization. So I wonder if you could maybe think about that, come back to that, but I'd like to put that out there. The other question was raised by actually a comment that Mark Malan made, South African, who now is in the U.S., works for the group Refugees International, who in a recent congressional hearing on AFRICOM said, Africa needs AFRICOM, not the mythical AFRICOM, but a unified geographic command that can make a clear and credible commitment to providing long-term sustainable support to African partner countries and organizations. That's a tall order for any organization, any single organization to fulfill. And it's not clear to me that AFRICOM can really do that. So the question that this raises is a problem of who's public diplomacy and who are really the stakeholders. You touch on that a little bit when you speak about the different audiences that AFRICOM has to respond to. But it's also a question of, well, what happens to Africa's public diplomacy? The problems that we've had in the past with foreign, shall we say, intervening forces or foreign presences on the continent has been that it tends to undermine local capacity. And to what extent could AFRICOM, in your view, build local capacities for public diplomacy between Zambia and its neighbors, or between ECOWAS and SADC? So what will be the relationship, in your view, or could be the relationship between an American-driven public diplomacy towards Africa and the continental or regional public diplomacies, and how do you mediate potential competition? The final point that I would just put out there is that, echoing the last point about the importance of dollars and funding, and that you cannot do public diplomacy on the cheap, in Africa in particular, this is all the more of a problem because you're trolling for already scarce resources for the continent. And so how would we argue that the resources, the limited resources that are available, should go to AFRICOM rather than to USAID, for example, or to other non-governmental organizations that are active on the continent, or the UN for that matter? So let me just put it out there. I don't, we might, should we take a few questions
Sure.
and then come back
Sure.
to those comments? Can you also identify yourself? I know I've met some of you, but not everyone, so who wants to start back there?
My name is Simone Kaatsen. I'm working for the Netherlands Consulate General in New York. And I think you pointed out some very important points of how of possible remedies for the image of AFRICOM in Africa. But how would you see the role of the African Union and what already has been done in Africa in your whole strategy? That's the point that I'm interested in.
Well, if I may venture, we've been talking about framing the whole day. This is
what's your name?
sorry, I'm Floris van Heuvel. I work at the Dutch Embassy in Washington, D.C. Sorry to dominate.
Dutch
the
mafia.
Decided to jump in. But framing, of course, you haven't really touched on that or indirectly, but I was wondering to hear your thoughts on that, because I think it's something that could be very useful to look at it through that lens. You described a number of the feelings that exist and that already set the number of frames apparently present in Africa. And we should try to, looking at it from the American perspective, try to change or influence those frames by erecting counter frames. But I don't know whether you've been thinking along those terms already.
My questions are, why AFRICOM want to have a military bases in Africa? And the second question is, how it is African best interest to have those military bases? My third question is AFRICOM just a creation like another hard power tool to control Africa? More?
Okay. Well, my goodness, we have quite a few questions on the table.
Why don't we come back,
Okay.
we'll do a second round,
Let
give
me
you a chance
see.
to...
All right. We have a going. Well, on the first point, I think which you raised about my argument that public diplomacy would be an effective remedy for the image problem. I think it would be an effective image because I think we have to be clear first I would say what public diplomacy cannot and cannot do. There are certain things public diplomacy cannot do, whether you're talking about AFRICOM or whether you're talking about US foreign policy broadly. Public diplomacy cannot fix the lack of a coherent and a consistent mission or consistent policy. It's not going to do that, whether it's on AFRICOM or in terms of US foreign policy to any particular region. It's going to be very difficult on the ground if you haven't got a consistent policy. Public diplomacy is not going to be able to fix the lack of political will that is sometimes needed both within an administration or on Capitol Hill to do certain things which are necessary. So we have to be very realistic about what it can achieve. The reason for narrowing the problem was, I think, in this particular aspect of AFRICOM, its image problem, and getting the diagnosis for it and the causes, I think public diplomacy would be a remedy. But if the Congress were not to give the appropriate appropriation in terms of funding, public diplomacy is not going to be able to fix that. If you have a lack of commitment on the part of a new administration, which comes in November and it's not committed to AFRICOM, public diplomacy is not going to fix that. So I think my response in a nutshell would be, when it comes in terms of my diagnosis of some of the problems, public diplomacy strategy can help to deal with those. The second, about a sustained commitment. One of the historic problems in terms of Africa's and US engagement with Africa has been the lack of a long-term sustained commitment to the continent. And there is, of course, both in reality and the perception, that the United States withdrawals are the first sign of political difficulty on the continent. And I think AFRICOM is a sign that this might be changing, that this might signal a new approach, that our engagement with Africa would be more long-term and more sustained. In terms of the third aspect, question you raised about the relationship between US public diplomacy strategy and national or regional strategies. Clearly, the objective which the United States has in terms of AFRICOM and public diplomacy would be, I think, say fundamentally different from what, say, Zambia, I think was the example you gave, or Liberia might have. Because here, the thrust is, this is an American initiative, a US initiative, and it has to seek to explain, to persuade, and convince African governments, elites, people about what this AFRICOM is going to actually do. So I think the objectives are different. But having said that, clearly you have to be sensitive and to engage with the media, what the governments are saying in particular countries, and how they're explaining and portraying AFRICOM, both in terms of government-owned media, in terms of more independent sources. And you ignore those at your peril. To Simona, I think, on the role of the African Union, so far, in contrast to the sub-regional organizations like ECOWAS, SADC, the African Union, to my knowledge, has not come down one way or the other in terms of a formal position in relation to AFRICOM. But I think one of the possible areas, of course, of cooperation is that now that AFRICOM would be seeking to establish its own sub-brigades and its own brigades on the continent so that it could do a more effective job in terms of regional peacekeeping. This is a possible area where AFRICOM could lend a practical hand of assistance. Of all the sub-regional organizations, I think ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, is much farther advanced than the others in terms of developing its capacity to do peacekeeping on the continent, whether in Sierra Leone or in Liberia or elsewhere. And one of the challenges facing the African Union, and you see it's been doing a commendable job in Darfur and elsewhere, is that it lacks the capacity and the resources, the training to do an effective, robust peacekeeping. And I think in those sorts of areas, in terms of regional peacekeeping training and exercises, AFRICOM has a very potentially useful role to play in helping the AU develop its own capacity. And this is one of the, I think, elements which needs to be underlined and stressed, that it is there to help Africans develop the capacity to handle more effectively their own security issues. Okay? I'll come back to you. Let me just go through. On the framing, perhaps you could just say briefly what you understand as framing before I attempt to address, just to make sure that what you consider framing.
Frame your question.
Well,
It's a pop
I
quiz.
could imagine that you just mentioned two frames. Actually.
Yes.
The frame in Africa that is AFRICOM is all about neo-colonialism, about the US wanting to exert new influence. And your counter frame could be, no, AFRICOM is about a strong and structural commitment of the US to Africa, to African security. And another frame would be the one that you mentioned, that it's a struggle between, or perceived struggle between China and the US over influence in China, in Africa. So those are all frames that you can be aware of and you can do something.
Yeah. Well, in that case, I think then that suggests a number of frames which could be used to explain what AFRICOM is about and what its mission is and what its goals are. I mean, for example, on the China bit, I think if the responses we've sometimes have had is, no, this is not about China, it does not have a ring of truth. And if something does not have a ring of truth, it's not going to be persuasive. The question is how you respond to a question, is this about China? Clearly, any nation has to be sensitive to its own strategic interests. And it will be quite unusual and perhaps not particularly responsible if one was not, a country was not aware of what potential competitors are doing in different parts of the world. But the issue is that is not the only motivating factor. And even in terms of access to energy supplies and oil supplies, clearly it is in our nation's interest to have access to energy supplies, but it's also in the interests of African countries to make sure that they can have stable markets to sell their energy and oil, which they can then use and resources for development. So it's how you explain these mutuality of interests which is important. And on the question from the Consul General of Senegal, and she raised some of the concerns, as you can see, which I had touched on in the formal part of my presentation. Why do you need military bases in Africa? Which was part, of course, of the mixed messages I was saying earlier on, because the first explanation was, yes, we need a physical presence. And this sort of hijacked, if you would, the whole discussion of AFRICOM. And as I was saying at the outset, it was put in the cart before the horse. The location issue should have come at the very end. When you've explained the mission, you've explained the goals. But a lot of the discussion at the outset was, they're looking for military bases. Now, where is this going to be? Is this going to be in the west, the north, the south, the east? And then we've had a pullback now where the position now is no decision has been made on a base It's still out there in Stuttgart, Germany. It's not going to be a physical presence, okay, at this point. Now, is this in Africa's interest, or is this going to be another tool for domination? Again, some of the concerns which I had mentioned. And I think one of the arguments, of course, which have to be made and which to convince African publics is how this is going to be in their own security interests. I think one of the points, it's sort of interesting because the African continent has been the only continent which has had this splintered approach in terms of US security engagement, where it was divided between the three commands, Pacific Command, Central Command, and European Command. Most times, what you would get from African elites or African leaders or what have you is that the United States does not take Africa seriously. Okay? And the argument would be made, well, you see, another example is, look, they don't even take us seriously enough to give up our own separate command. They're still looking at us through the prism of Europe, or the Pacific Command, or Central Command. We're not even important enough to have a separate command with a 4-star general who can go up to Capitol Hill and advocate for Africa and for the continent, rather than just having 10 minutes in a congressional hearing when you've discussed Europe, you've discussed major challenges in Central, and then, by the way, let's talk about Africa. Ordinarily, this would be something which should be receptive to your ordinary African, that, look, we've come at it belatedly, 50 years after the Bureau of African Affairs was established in the State Department, and finally, we're taking Africa seriously enough to have your separate command, rather than saying, all right, you're going to be the one continent which we're going to use in a divided way. So this should be something which should resonate both in terms of symbolism as to what it says about America's approach, and also in terms of the practical elements of what Africa would actually do. So I think those kinds of arguments have not been made effectively, because the choice is, does this continent, 50-plus countries, want to be considered as a subset of 3 commands, or does it want to be taken seriously in its own right with its own separate command on par with the Europe-Pacific Central Command? Okay? Those are some reactions to the questions. But I know that Simona, I don't know, she was trying to get in again when I was responding to her question.
Yeah, you mentioned that the discussion on location should be at the end of the whole story. But taken into account the fact that there is not a country that wants to host AFRICOM, isn't that a serious signal that maybe there is not so much need or will to cooperate with AFRICOM?
Well, there's been at least one country, which is Liberia, which has gone on record as wanting to host AFRICOM. But I think, as I was suggesting, there's serious concerns which have been raised, but I don't think, my own view, that they're insurmountable. On the concern, for example, about the militarization of foreign policy, which is one of the concerns, the vast majority of US assistance towards Africa is going through civilian agencies. It's not going through the military. Sure, in Washington, DOD has a hefty budget, but in this case, the bulk of it is still going through USAID, through the State Department, not going through AFRICOM. That argument has not been made, because that's just a fact. And that's not going to change. The vast majority will still be through the civilian agencies, but the perception is that it's going to go through AFRICOM. And sure enough, of course, in foreign policy and diplomacy, there are, you can have problems and resistance, but these positions, as you know, you have diplomats around the table, they're not fixed, they're not stagnant, they can change over time. And you can work issues and move issues where you can actually change. And that's the job of diplomats, and the good diplomats and effective diplomats do that all the time. They do that every day. It may not happen overnight. It may not happen in a week. It may not happen over months, but over a period. If you have an effective strategy, you have clear goals, and you work at different levels, and you understand what the issue, you can move public opinion, while at the same time understanding, as I said, that the specific problem of Africa would also be understood in the context of what the United States does more broadly in terms of its engagement and its policy towards Africa. We'll take some more?
Yes.
Okay.
We'll just go, follow-up question, and then we'll take a new round.
Okay. So there's a follow-up.
I'm sorry, but I'll have to, again, to ask why does AFRICOM want this military base in Africa? Because I did not really get what you said about why they want that. And according to your expose, I mean, I came late, but I think I understood that Africa is trying to make Africans understand that's the best thing that could happen to them. But according to your expose, even if maybe some leaders, I'll say one African leader agrees with that, Africans don't want that. They don't want it. That's what I understood from what you said, that you guys have to work hard on that to make African people accept and cooperate with that idea. But it seems like they're not ready to do that.
Well, I think, sure, I would agree with you. There's resistance. As I was saying, negative perceptions of the command, a misunderstanding of what it's meant to do, and whether the reasons which have been stated are the real reasons, or whether they're just ostensible reasons and there are other factors. There's a tremendous degree of concern and uncertainty about what AFRICOM can do or should be doing. But if you think of in the area of humanitarian assistance, there is if you think about peacekeeping, there's a heavy lifting which can be done, which only the military can provide, and I've seen it firsthand when in a crisis, when you need the support which only the military can actually give you, whether in terms of delivering humanitarian assistance and so forth. If you think about the expertise and the assistance which is needed to develop capacities on the continent for peacekeeping, training and exercises, so that African countries and regional organizations can do a more effective job in dealing with their own security. I mean, the kinds of exercises that it's now doing through the ACOTA program, the African Contingency Operations Training and Assistance program, which has a well-established record of success in training African militaries in peacekeeping operations. That's the kind of assistance, I think, which AFRICOM can provide. And also, in West Africa, one of the growing problems is that off the West African coast is becoming a major transshipment point for narcotics into Europe and elsewhere. And the countries in West Africa, and representing, of course, Senegal, so you'll be familiar with this problem. The countries in West Africa, Senegal, Liberia, Sierra Leone, have absolutely very little or no capacity to patrol their own territorial waters. So they have no idea what is going through. There's a major crisis now in Freetown about, drug trafficking, landing, and a plane coming through with narcotics. They lack the capacity to patrol their own waters to actually police it. And some of the technical assistance which I think they can get and which Africa can provide can actually help to enhance their own security. I think so in terms of improving maritime security in the Gulf of Guinea would be an important way that the command can lend a practical hand of assistance. But I think those arguments have to be made. They have to be made consistently, and they have to be explained. And the fact also that this is not going to be the entire U.S. policy towards the continent, that the job which the State Department does, the job which USAID does, all of that will continue, and this will be a complement to those efforts.
If I can just add, we have a long list, and I want to get to that very quickly, but I think the other response that one might add to your question about, why would AFRICOM want to have a military base in Africa as well, every other command has a base in the region that it is charged with working in. So we have to think about, is AFRICOM really unique, or is it simple? I mean, if in fact it is a replica of the other existing commands, then one would expect to have the same kind of military infrastructures, civil-military relationship as any of the other commands are. Otherwise, it cannot operate in the way in which it is intended to do. And that comes back, I think, to the point that Dr. Williams was making earlier about the mixed messages about what exactly are the objectives of AFRICOM. But if AFRICOM is supposed to give Africa its due in security policy writ large, global security policy of the U.S., then of course you would want some kind of forward-basing ability. And one might want to think about it that way, because what message are you sending by keeping AFRICOM in Stuttgart? Yes, it's a little bit closer than having them in Washington, but frankly, when it comes down to really being able to follow through on the tasks that AFRICOM is supposed to do, aside from the public diplomacy tasks, it's going to be much more difficult to do that if you're in Stuttgart as opposed to elsewhere. But let's, we have a long list. Let me start, is it Habib? Right. Can you reintroduce yourself? And then I have, is it Kristen? Christina, Barbara? Ingrid, sorry, getting everyone mixed up. And then we have Jim, and then we are over here, right? So let's just take, we have, everyone basically has a question. We'll just work our way around the room. I think that would be the easiest.
So
Habib, why don't you begin?
Yes, Habib Ko. I'm a doctor by profession, but I work with the Somali community. And the role that you've been talking about, particularly of AFRICOM in terms of developing the capacity for peace building and security in the region is very important. And Professor Paul Collier has written a very important book, The Bottom Billion, which has made that argument that it's a very key component of being able to lift areas in Africa out of poverty traps. But he makes the point as well that there needs to be, for that role, there needs to be an exit strategy. And if you go down the line of talking about that role of AFRICOM, it might come up that that's fine, but what is its exit strategy to reassure different parts of Africa about that role being, having that, AFRICOM having that clear function, that it would see itself as developing capacity, but withdrawing at the right time point. And is it possible for it to have that exit strategy and so articulate it as part of its public diplomacy, or is that not consistent with its overall aim?
My name is Christina Tribble. I work for the State Department. Christina Tribble, which might actually help frame my question and comment. I take exception a little bit to, you made a statement that said that public diplomacy is too important to be left to the civilian sector for AFRICOM. And alone, right. And from my perspective, sort of looking at public diplomacy from where I sit as a public affairs officer with the State Department, it's not so much that I think it's too important, but that looking at your strategic recommendations and your key messages, I see those as a small sliver of public diplomacy. And that really at the kernel of several of them is not necessarily an issue of public diplomacy, but about AFRICOM being clear about why they're there and about what African governments are looking from AFRICOM, what AFRICOM wants to get from foreign governments, and then sort of the ability to communicate that to African publics comes much later in the process to me. And so I think as a public diplomacy professional, I sort of take exception as characterizing these activities as the whole field of public diplomacy. I look at this as public affairs on a pretty short-term advocacy basis. And where the concern over militarizing foreign policy comes is that if you resource this as public diplomacy in the context of AFRICOM, public diplomacy in the context of the rest of the relationship already has so few resources. And the Defense Department dwarfs, anything that we do. And so then the main dialogue or this main relationship between the American people and the African people takes place in the context of AFRICOM. And so, I would rather talk about the issue of AFRICOM in the context of public affairs for these military agreements, and then separate out this larger issue of public diplomacy and the broader U.S. relationship with Africa. Its policies, its people, its institutions, its education, the whole basket.
I'm actually quite intrigued by what your remark was, if it is really an image problem or is there something else, and it's probably also my own lack of knowledge about AFRICOM. But I was it's probably not about the soft power of what AFRICOM can do, humanitarian aid and so on. It's probably all about the hard power that could also be in place. And what I was wondering is, when exactly does AFRICOM come in action? Does it require a multinational decision on this, the Security Council, or is it purely an American decision?
Why don't we break it here? We'll take a next tranche and give Abi a chance to respond.
Okay. Well, I think on Habib's first question about an exit strategy, I think one of the most compelling arguments about an exit strategy is the fact that one of the most difficult things is to get, for a whole number of reasons, which we know, U.S. troops deployed in African conflicts, for a whole range of reasons, which is why the African countries themselves, at the continental level, like the AU and ECOWAS, are really keen to develop their own capacities because they realize that many times when the alarm bells sound, not only the United States but other countries in Europe and elsewhere would not come to their rescue. And that is why you have to develop their own capacities on the continent. So in terms of so I think the concern is not that you're going to have a long-term presence in African conflicts with U.S. troops on the ground. The real challenge has been, how do you get U.S. troops when needed to engage, even for a short period of time. Okay? But having said that, I think that will depend on the particular conflict that where you're going to have AFRICOM engaged in. So, for example, well, let me put it another way. Let me go back. I think one of the real reasons behind AFRICOM is precisely the concern that you do not want U.S. troops on African soil doing the heavy lifting and engaging, and that Africans should be doing this. And that also is consistent with the feeling on the continent. Okay? So I think, again, there's a mutuality of interest, where there's a great resistance to deploy American troops on many occasions for domestic reasons and so on, and Africans also want to be doing the heavy lifting themselves. But what they lack is the training and the capacity and to do the job.
So that means that there is, if you articulate, there is an exit strategy, because you said a minute ago, you talked about risk exit. You said a minute ago the function was there was a role because there was a lot of heavy lifting to do. You modified that now by saying the heavy lifting is not by AFRICOM. The heavy lifting is to be done in the future, the capacity growth by those African nations' resources, and our role is to raise their capacity.
Yeah,
So
absolutely, yeah.
Therefore, if that is the true state of goal, then one of your possible strengths is to articulate the fact that it is there for that role, and then to exit.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because the important, what is lacking on the continent is the technical expertise, the capacity, that particularly the AU, less so in the case of ECOWAS, particularly in the AU, to do peacekeeping. And that's what AFRICOM can lend. On Christina's point, I understand the bureaucratic and not only bureaucratic, but even in terms of the literature and the difference between public affairs and public diplomacy. We dealt with it in peacekeeping, dealing with US troops in Macedonia and working with them. Military do affairs, diplomats do public diplomacy. So I understand that sort of the traditional perception that public affairs is what you do at Camp Able Century. If you go over to the US base and if you go to the US embassy, they do public diplomacy. So that also has, I know, has been part of the dynamic. But your point about framing it in, well, two things. I think the public diplomacy challenge for AFRICOM will not be a short-term thing. This is going to be a long-term thing because the challenges will change and evolve over time. And the public diplomacy strategy is not going to be static and is going to be responding to changing circumstances and changing events. So what the challenge is today and what this public diplomacy strategy is going to be crafted to address would not be the same in 5, would not be the same in 10 years. So I'm not envisaging a strategy which is going to be fixed. Because if this, as I'm suggesting, AFRICOM is going to signal a new long-term commitment and engagement on the part of the United States with AFRICOM, it means that the public diplomacy strategy will be changing and will be evolving. But having said that, the argument I was making was not that this is going to be the whole of America's public diplomacy approach to the continent. The whole range of other issues which would have to be addressed. USAID would have challenges in terms of its own development assistance and how that is perceived and how that is being done. The State Department would have its own challenges, what it's doing in Kenya. It's not AFRICOM which would have to explain to the people in Kenya or elsewhere what US foreign policy is towards Kenya and the recent crisis and what its position was. It's not AFRICOM which is going to explain what US policy is towards Zimbabwe. Let's take all the hotspots, or what it should or should not do towards Mugabe and what the response should be. So tonight's discussion was not on US public diplomacy and Africa, which could be a whole different discussion, of which AFRICOM would be a subset. And then we could look at how US approaches its public diplomacy in terms of hotspots, the Zimbabwe's, the Kenyas, how it does with how the public diplomacy is framed in terms of political transitions in Africa and changes in leadership, the whole range of things. But just to suggest that this is just one sliver, and which is why I made the final point that whatever it is that AFRICOM tries to do in its public diplomacy cannot be divorced from US foreign policy more broadly. And also that means its public diplomacy more broadly, which would affect what it can do. And let me just a quick response to Ingrid. The command will be fully stood up, to use the military term, on the 1st of October this year, when it will assume all the responsibilities which are still being subsumed under the European command. And this is one decision I'm sure Washington is happy to say will not require Security Council or any other decision by the United Nations, my former employer.
Is that a very quick, because we have, all right.
It's not, the U.S. Embassy also does public affairs. The distinction was not that I was making, again, the military also does public diplomacy, but sort of this time frame, not necessarily short or long, but that you're advocating around a relatively set of hard power issues, i.e. military bases and military cooperation, which is a small subset of the overall large set of public diplomacy. And so what I didn't see in the discussion of AFRICOM was sort of this notion of the exchange of culture, people, ideas, institutions, infrastructure building, and other areas that are a component of public diplomacy. And so it's not that the military does one or the other and the State Department does one or the other. We also do public affairs when related directly to policy issues. And so I think my only posit was that if you resource this generously for public diplomacy, that you're only resourcing a small sliver of public diplomacy that is not the larger issue. So I would say resource it in proportion to public diplomacy as a whole and the other actors in the field, so that the military doesn't sort of get the larger chunk of it, and then what they do as public diplomacy, this small sliver, is not representative of this whole relationship.
That's a very nice segue to Jim. In the military.
Okay, well, so you guys know I'm Jim Gregory. I'm an Army major. Like, I know I'm going to Stuttgart after this. I know to AFRICOM or to UCOM. I'll be at one or two commands, and I'm a public affairs officer. So many of these things will probably be on my shoulders. I also feel compelled. I really think there's a bit of a misperception of what a combatant command headquarters actually is. Because I hear U.S. bases on African soil, and we're talking about a four-star flag officer and his staff. And that is what a combatant command headquarters is. It's, okay, his staff is rather large, but we're not talking about infantry soldiers. We're talking about staff people. Paper pushers, former action guy. I don't want to think of myself, but nothing. Yeah, but we're not talking about troops, and so an exit strategy is something I wanted to talk about. And I would say that AFRICOM, the headquarters, wouldn't have an exit strategy, but the existence of it would facilitate the entrance or not of U.S. troops in times of need. And more importantly, to especially the African people, the exit of those troops when necessary. And that's why it's important to have it, because without that four-star leadership saying, this isn't the right time. I know the Africans, I live with them, I'm around them, this isn't right, we shouldn't do it now. If he's not there, he doesn't have that perspective. So that's just my 2 cents. My question, though.
I think I'm just saying that articulating that is quite powerful.
And I think that the strategic objectives you laid out are right on, because it's not a silver bullet. AFRICOM is not a silver bullet, and it can easily be oversold. And the rest of them, I wrote them down. I'll take them with me. But my question, though, is, could you discuss the importance or not of addressing the world or public opinion outside Africa?
Sandra.
Well, my question has to do with the poor, benighted little neighbor of ours called Haiti. I would like to know whether you think, since you served there, whether the United States has been a good actor or a bad actor there in the last decade, and why, if we haven't been able to turn Haiti into a kind of showcase economically and in terms of good government, we think we can be of such help to the Africans. I don't understand why Haiti eludes us so consistently and persistently. And I'm interested also if you have insights into this, into how you think the Haitian elite feeds either positively or negatively into this dismal dynamic.
We can just say that AFRICOM has absolutely no role in Haiti.
This is a non-AFRICOM issue.
Shall we just quickly wrap up and then you can have the final word? I have Tim and I have, is it Kristen Kahn?
No, I'm Kristen Knudsen.
Knudsen, sorry. There's so many Kristens and Christinas here, my apologies. So Tim and then Kristen.
I actually just wanted to add a point or follow up on Abby's. My name is Tim, and having no from the United Nations already, but his point that both other aspects of U.S. policy will impact on how this goes. And I think there might be more than many people realize, including people from the United Nations, that the United States, including under the Bush, or especially under the Bush administration, increased overall development spending sharply, and including to Africa. And by a recent accounting I saw, was one of only 2 major donors who actually met their stated goals towards expanding aid to Africa. And also in this period has been a large expansion of security of peacekeeping forces in the world, and many of them in Africa, to an all-time high. And the United States supported and paid for its share of those operations, many of which presumably, I think, demonstrably have benefited Africa. So there are some resources on that side of the ledger that could be up. That was good.
Jim actually provided me a nice lead-in, really. I'm sorry. I'm Kristen Knudsen, not Khan, and that's important because I'm going to speak as a humanitarian. Trying to formulate this, I'm sure, as you know, from working, a UN humanitarian, but I'm not going to speak as a UN staff member now. I'm literally putting myself into that definition of humanitarian because I'm going to hit on the core principles because it has to do with my point. As I'm sure you're aware from working in the UN and from being exposed to the issues, but I think that when I was listening to your exposition, the audience that I think is missing that Jim touched on in his question to you is the external, and I would qualify it as the external internal actors. Because I think it's not just about selling AFRICOM to African governments and African people. You've got a large audience that is inherently mistrustful, and I think justifiably mistrustful based on previous experience, about the aims and goals of AFRICOM, whether it's physically located on African soil or not, what it does. But I'm speaking as a humanitarian. Every time that, the phrase humanitarian assistance is joined to AFRICOM or military or anything, you clench because there's a lot of concern with the blurring of the lines between humanitarians and militaries. And I think one of the large pockets of concern within not just UN but NGO communities is very much this aspect of what you actually allude to in your messages is, AFRICOM using this humanitarian assistance excuse, justification for what they're going to be doing that we don't feel comfortable with because military assets are always a last case option for a humanitarian. And so actually, I'm going to switch over to Jim. I'm going to say that I feel very reassured because you actually put the case for, what the actual advantage is in the most succinct terms that I think we've heard all night. It's having a decision maker on the ground. You can talk about when it is going to be useful and when it's not. But then from my point of view, it's also having access to a decision maker who can facilitate when that decision needs to be made and when it's not. But coming back over here, I just think that what I would like to make as a comment and not really a question is that I think there is this audience, this external but working very much within the African context that needs to be included within the audience analysis and the targeting messages as well.
Okay. Well, I agree absolutely with what Christine and Jim have said about needing to address other stakeholders, if you will. I'd framed the talk tonight as an AFRICOM and Africa and the public diplomacy. But of course, there are lots of skeptics in this country. So there is another dimension of the public diplomacy, if you will, activity which AFRICOM has to do, which is to convince elites and stakeholders in this country who have been very skeptical also about its mission and NGOs. And we had the conference we attended, I participated here last February. We had somebody on my panel from one of the NGOs who was very skeptical about and AFRICOM's role. And then, as you said, also humanitarians on the ground. So I think there's work to be done there as well. So I agree. In terms of the assistance that AFRICOM could potentially provide, humanitarian assistance, this would be one of the many activities and the roles which it would have. That's always a concern, and I understand that which humanitarians have whenever the military is involved, because there are core humanitarian principles, and there are quite legitimate and sensible reasons why they do not want those principles to become compromised. They're having the same debate now, interestingly, in New York about the responsibility to protect and whether or not you're going to have military assets used in terms of for protection, and what that might do to which the humanitarians in OCHA think might compromise their role in using a military, having military options for the responsibility to protect. So I understand those concerns, and clearly the military has to be sensitive to those concerns. However, there are times, as we've seen in Bosnia and elsewhere, where the only people who can provide the assets which you need on the ground are the military in a dire situation. And of course, they just have to make sure that it's done judiciously and not compromise humanitarian principles, and it's short and targeted. On Haiti, which is slightly outside, of course, the focus of the presentation this evening. But as you said, yes, I spent some time in Haiti in the 90s, in the fourth of a series of UN peacekeeping missions. And that in itself suggests part of the problem on the part not only of the United States, but on the part of the international community. In a way, it is very similar to Africa, because one of the fundamental problems in terms of the international community's approach to Haiti, it is never sustained, and it is never long-term. And then we leave, and then we have to re-engage again. And this has been a pattern which has been repeated for a number of years, that you have a peacekeeping mission and there is no sustained commitment and a lack of the political support you need, either on the part of the Security Council to do the long-term work which is necessary in places like Haiti. The Security Council really operates very much like a bad doctor. I wonder whether Habib might have some views on this, because if you go to any good doctor and you're down with an infection, what the doctor always says to you, look, you have a course of antibiotics, you have to take the whole course. If you stop halfway through, you'll have a relapse. So you might feel better, you have to take the whole course. The Security Council gives you a course, and then as soon as the patient begins to show signs of recovery, takes the remaining medicine and gives it to another patient. And that, of course, Haiti was a victim of this kind of approach, and this was precisely the kind of thing that the new Peace-Building Commission was meant to fix. We had in 2005, during the last reform of Kofi Annan's waning days, was to come up with a new peace-building architecture with a commission, a peace-building support office, and a peace-building fund, which would be able to do the long-term sustained commitment and peace building which countries like Haiti need. So that was part of the problem. But having said that, all my own experience suggests that it is nationals, not internationals, who build countries when all is said and done. And if any international action is going to be effective, it has to be harnessed to local action and national responsibility. And one of the great problems with Haiti is that the absolute lack of a responsible political elite in the country. A responsible political elite which can take the actions and which are needed for the development of the country. So that is a fundamental problem. And then there's also an absence of a political culture of compromise within the country, where it's an all or nothing approach to politics. I mean, democracy at the bottom line, really, in its essence, is a non-violent form of conflict resolution. That's what democracy is. And of course, it means that you have to have a lot of compromise. And 51, 49%, but in Haiti, it's an all or nothing approach. You either get 100% or you get nothing. And building a culture, a political culture of compromise, and developing a political elite which has a sense of responsibility in the country, it's a huge challenge for Haiti. And then one final point, of course, is to try, in terms of the engagement of the international community, to try to help to develop the kinds of small businesses and the economic, in terms of small businesses which would help countries like Haiti. If you look even in terms of the Millennium Development Goals, in which I spent a lot of time working on at the UN, one of the weaknesses, it focuses, to my mind, perhaps too greatly on poverty evaluation and not on economic growth. There's a great deal in terms of looking at poverty alleviation and not in terms of economic growth and how you develop and build wealth in countries. And so it is skewed. And enough, you have to get the balance right, not only in terms of poverty alleviation, but economic growth and how you build wealth. And that needs to also be done in places like Haiti. But fundamentally, it's always a national responsibility. It is nationals who build countries, not internationals. And any international action has to be harnessed to local efforts if it's going to be successful.
Would that be your comment on grants as well?
Now we're really extending. So I know there are probably many other questions, but we have, I think, run out of time. So, and I know you still have a long several days ahead of you, so we don't want to keep you from getting a bit of rest. But let me thank Abby Williams for coming all the way out here from Washington, stepping outside the Beltway and joining us here. And thank all of you for terrific questions. I think they've given all of us a great deal of food for thought. Before we give a round of applause to Abby, I also will shamelessly put on my Dean's hat and plug our latest product from our very own, which all of you now have had, and it's literally hot off the press. I think it just arrived this afternoon, right?
Everyone got a copy.
Has everyone? Great. And what this is actually a transcript of a conference that Professor Phil Sieb conceived and organized and brought all of us together. And I would hazard a guess it was probably the first one of now a series. We started a trend, as we like to at the Annenberg School, but we started a trend of looking at AFRICOM, and it was one of the very first to look at particularly the public diplomacy dimension. So we thought this would be a really useful transcript rather than just giving you a summary. And we do have, there is a Cliff Note version that we can get to folks who want the short version of this. But we thought it would be really helpful for students of public diplomacy to actually have a transcript of what the dialogues are between the different stakeholders, because this does reflect NGOs, humanitarians, military officers, civilians, in government, outside of government, Americans, non-Americans. So we hope you'll all find it useful. And again, thank you so much, Abi.